Now, during the SABC's ongoing battle between management and staff, a split in the board has also become very apparent, with some board members supporting retrenchments and others not. And in addition to that, the crucial for the decision to be made regarding the future of the SABC, it would have to be a board that can agree on such important matters. But should it maintain its PBS or public broadcast mandate, or is it time to turn the public broadcaster, or as much of it as can be, into a commercial entity? Joining us now to discuss some of these matters is SABC Board Chairperson Bongumusa Makhathini. Thanks for your time, Mr. Makhathini. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. Good morning, and good morning to you at home.
Mr. Makhathini, it's been an eventful few days here at the SABC. You've had a front row seat to these developments, and with the benefit of hindsight, how do you feel about how things have played out?
There are procedures and guidelines in terms of how board functions. So we as a board operate based on board resolution and board decisions. And those board decisions and resolutions become what guide the executives in executing their work. So my role as chair of the board is to communicate the resolutions and the decisions of the board. And when the board has voted on the matter or reached a consensus, that becomes a decision of a board. So the truth of the matter is, we have met as a board and took a resolution of what needed to be done around Section 189. The first resolution was taken on the 4th of June, which mandated management to embark on a consultation process, which they did. On the 30th of October, we had another meeting where we adopted the report by management, mandating them to implement the retrenchment plans. And that was done as a collective and by the board.
Mr. Makhathini, was Section 189 the only option at your disposal? Was there no other way that the SABC could have averted the jobs bloodbath that we are currently facing?
Thank you. On this issue, we've been talking about this for more than 2 years already. And in that 2 years, a lot of other things have been done. Just to name a few, we've been able to drive our costs down in the last 3 years. We've been able to come up with new revenue streams. We've been able to launch, for example, a new editorial policy. There's a whole lot of other things that have been done that proves and show that retrenchment was not the first thing that we jumped to. But everything that is being done is guided by the turnaround plan, which was approved by the board. Nobody opposed that turnaround plan. And in that turnaround plan, cost cutting is one of the imperatives that needed to be driven. And there's two main cost drivers. It's a salary bill, which is sitting at about 43% of our total expenditure. And then it's a signal distribution cost, which is almost R1 billion to Centec. And the truth of the matter is, in the situation we are faced with, we have to manage our costs because there are struggles with the revenues because of the economic meltdown. But the truth of the matter is, it is also a compliance issue. The same government, Minister of Finance, gave us a bailout and gave us conditions. One of those conditions was to cut our salary bill. And they have made it very clear that there would be no further bailouts for the SABC, which then means we have to do everything we can to make sure that we get SABC to be financially viable. So there is a number of things that will be done. It's not only retrenchment. There's talks of, for example, freezing salaries for about 3 years for everybody, from board down to general employees. There is a review of the number of sick leave days and so forth. So there is a whole lot of things that are being done. But the truth of the matter is, we need to reduce our salary bill by 700 million. So whatever we do must be significant enough to get us out of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Ms. Makhathini, one of the issues that staff have been crying for since the start of these talks was that there should be a transparency and fairness of a process. That hasn't happened. Are you aware of that?
As a board, we've mandated management to consult, and the report that came back to us, if you look at the Labour Relations Act, it directs that consultation must happen over a 60-day period, having 4 meetings. They've done it over 120 days, which is about 4 months, and they've had about 16 meetings. And even after that period, unions, for example, were allowed to make submissions. And we continue to invite submissions because the intention is to minimize the impact as much as we can. That's why initially we spoke about 600 employees that were going to be affected. We are now down at 400. And because we have about 170 vacancies, some of the 400 may qualify for those vacancies that we have and will then be absorbed. So the intention really is to minimize the impact, but with taking into consideration everything that we are faced with, we're projecting a loss of about 1.2 billion rand come end of the financial year. And certainly, if we don't do anything, SABC will find itself where Denel is, where we can no longer be in a position to pay salaries. So at the end of the day, we have to work together and find ways to make sure that the impact is minimized, but the right decisions and the turnaround plan is embedded and implemented.
Well, some of the cost that could be cut, some would argue, Mr. Makhathini, would be taking a look at the salaries of the executives. It would be taking a look at the board itself, for example, and the number of times that it attends, and some of the catering costs that we've seen that have been racked up because of meetings by the board and exec. Why were those things not looked at?
Let me clarify the cost. For example, the 6 million that was highlighted as the cost for catering. About 4 million of that 6 million relates to our canteens and restaurants that we have across different offices. About 2 million rands of that talks to...
What canteens, Mr. Makhathini? Which canteens?
For example, where our employees have their lunches, that's a portion of that 600 covers that. So, and others has to do with special events like graduations for interns and so forth. So that figure has been explained. But when you talk about board fees, for an example, board of SABC has not had an increase since we joined in 2017 and will not have any board fee increase for the next 2 to 3 years.
There are staff members who have not had increases either, Mr. Makhathini, so that's not peculiar to the board.
What I was explaining is that the measures that are being explored and implemented cut across all levels. So there is no level that will not be affected. Everybody, like I've indicated, must contribute something. And maybe let's talk about, you talk about the salaries of the executives. The reduction that we are targeting here is 700 million. So let's say you look at the CEO, COO, and the CFO. When they were employed, they were working somewhere and there was a contractual agreement that we reached. So even if you were to, let's say, cut their salaries by 20% or 50%, it will not help us with the gap of 700 million that we need to save for us to be financially viable. But of course, we'll continue to explore and to look at any other option and any other thing that can be done. And that's why we are meeting today as a board to see what else can be done. But as we stand today, the board resolution still stands until we can have a meeting of the board, and that board will then apply its mind and look at everything that we have and see if there is any other thing that can be done. But so far, everything possible has been done and is on the table.
You see, Mr. Makhathini, what you've just said is what staff find so jarring. When you say if we cut at that level, it may not make any significant difference, but if you cut at a lower level, I mean, who then is entitled to a job here and who isn't? Because surely everybody would want to make an argument that their little job would also not make any significant impact on the bottom line of that 700 million that you are trying to chase.
Let me clarify. I'm not saying we will cut at the lower level and not cut. I'm saying we have to look at all levels. Everybody needs to make some form of a sacrifice and a contribution to make a difference. I was trying to make it clear that we are chasing this 700 million. So whatever we do should help us or bring us closer to that target so that we can be financially viable. Because if we are not, and we don't do enough, we'll still not be able to get ourselves out of the situation we are in currently.
Mr. Makhathini, again, the transparency issue. Let's talk about this organogram that you've come to. And were you consulted about that? Because it would seem as though on the shop floor, people were not consulted, and that organogram was a state secret for the most part. What do you know about how that organogram was actually compiled?
From where I sit as a board, we engage as a board and give management a mandate to go consult. And as part of that consultation, the Labour Relations Act will dictate and direct in terms of how that must be done. And my expectation is that the executives who are responsible for different divisions would have engaged with their people and socialize the proposed structure with them and get their input. That is the expectation from the board and from where we're sitting.
I will put it to you, Mr. Makhathini. I put it to you, that was not done, because you simply need to look at that organogram and go down to what is expected in terms of output from various departments and what you have done with that organogram, where you have treated it as cold numbers, not looking at what needs to be done, how this is going to affect output and input, but simply looking at we need to have so many people here for this division, this department, without any consideration for the final product.
From where I sit, that is at an operational level. As a board, we don't engage at the level of basically putting structures together. That gets put together by the executive and it gets presented to the board. And the board then trusts management that they've followed all the prescript and all the requirement in terms of consultation and making sure that whatever they propose and put together will still be fit for purpose and help them to be able to deliver the product and fulfill our mandate. In
terms of your oversight responsibility as the board, Mr. Makhathini, have you looked at that organogram?
We have looked at what has been presented to us and approved it.
You've approved it. Did you get an understanding of what that meant in actual terms of how operations are likely to be impacted?
Certainly.
So you think that organogram is actually fit for purpose and is fit to keep the SABC going and delivering on its public service mandate in the form in which you have now sent it out to the management to implement?
Let me explain something else here. I've said we're talking about 400 affected employees, and out of those 400, there is about 170 vacancies. And that 170 vacancies has been identified, and it shows that there is an understanding that there may be divisions, for example, where we need to beef up and where we need to add more people. But also this restructuring is also about making SABC fit and ready for the digital world, which means there may be skills that we currently don't have, or there may be positions that we currently don't have that we need to have for us to be able to deliver on our mandate and meet the demand of our customers and clients. So the truth of the matter is there is an appreciation that the restructuring will result to some areas needing more people than they currently have. But of course, there may be other areas where there is duplicate roles.
Ms. Makhathini, all that it says, when you look at that organogram, and I invite you as the chairperson of the board, bring the exec with you, because I don't think you or they understand in many instances what it is that you are actually doing. Because you need to come down to this studio, to any other department, look at what is being done. And then, especially in the newsroom, we're already short-staffed in many instances. Are you aware of that?
I am aware that there are departments like supply chain and maybe other areas where we are short-staffed, and this is why we have management has identified 170 vacancies, if I'm not mistaken. And those vacancies talks about filling some areas where there is need for more capacity.
So my question is, are you aware that people are being retrenched, yet departments are short-staffed? How does that square in your head?
From where I'm sitting at the moment, nobody has been retrenched yet. So there's been redundancy letters that have been issued, but the process is being open now to fill the vacancies, or rather to implement the new target operating model and fill the vacancies. And once that is done, if there are people who have not been absorbed, then we still need to look at that number at the end. But at the moment, nobody has been retrenched.
So let's talk about the letters that people receive, these redundancy letters that you talk about. What are they exactly? What do they mean?
It basically means that in the analysis that has been done, there are roles that maybe are duplicated. So if you have two roles, people doing the same thing, you have to rationalize that and maybe have one role. After you've assessed the workload and what is expected from that position or that role, and it's about looking at the output and the cost associated with what we have to do.
Well, people got letters, Mr. Makhathini, and those letters don't seem to indicate that they would have jobs beyond what they are being said. And from those letters, it seems that people will be out of a job by the end of the year. So what do those redundancy letters mean? What do they mean if you're saying they're not retrenchment letters?
Like I've indicated, ma'am, that at the moment we have 170 vacancies, that those people who are affected must apply and be considered for those vacancies.
But on what basis? On what basis are they applying for those jobs? Because that's a new position altogether.
Not all new positions, not all vacancies that I'm referring to are new. You will recall that when the process of Section 189 consultation started, the filling of vacancies was put on hold. So which means there may be vacancies that exist based on the normal skills and expectations of these roles. And now that we're opening that process, those vacancies can now be filled. And the people who are affected can apply for those roles. For an example, there may be people who will opt for an early retirement. And maybe somebody opting for an early retirement, maybe that role that that person occupies is not necessarily redundant. It means then it opened that vacancy for somebody who's impacted to be considered for that role. So there's still a lot that needs to be done to make sure that all vacancies that we currently exist and the new roles that have been created based on our digital journey and plan, all of those roles provide opportunities to further minimize the impact and reduce the number of people who ultimately have to be retrenched.
There are just so many things going on, Mr. Makhathini. You talk about the SABC's failure to generate revenue. When last have you been to Henley Studios?
I was there maybe 2 weeks ago.
And what did you find, Mr. Makhathini?
Oh no, when I was there, I was doing an inspection in preparation for the SCOPA visit. That's when I was there. So I was specifically looking at what we were going to be taking the SCOPA members through.
How many of those studios are operational and how many are not?
At the level where the board operates, there are guidelines in terms of what as the board we get involved in and what is it that we leave to management to do so that we can then be in a position to hold them accountable. You'll imagine having a chairperson basically operating and being all over the building. That on its own will be unacceptable, and it will be me blurring the lines.
How often do you come to the SABC though? I'm not talking about during COVID, but before COVID. How often were you here at Auckland Park, Mr. Makhathini?
Whenever I had meetings, whether it's a board meeting or I have meeting with executives, maybe in a week I will come there twice.
So from that, one would imagine that you would take a look around. But Mr. Makhathini, just moving forward, because we need to understand, in terms of those redundancy letters, are you still going to, is the executive going to continue with the instruction that those be handed out?
From where we're sitting, boards are run based on resolutions. So as it stands today, management has been given a mandate by the board to implement the retrenchment plan. Until there is a new resolution, management is expected to act on resolutions of the board.
So we unfortunately have to leave it there, Mr. Makhathini, but I'm sure it would be lovely for you to come and have a meeting with people down here on the shop floor and perhaps come and take a walk with your board, with your executive, and come and get a greater understanding of what actually goes on. Looking on the floor here, 1, 2, 3 cameras unmanned because one person has to jump from the jib to a camera, and sometimes even have to man the auto cue, you name it. And all the time, numbers are being cut. We don't see them as people, they are numbers. And yet, the product suffers, Mr. Makhathini. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Certainly, we'll do our best and look at all the details and the evidence that can be presented to us to show if there are gaps, and we are willing to make sure that those gaps are filled.
Come through, Mr. Makhathini. Come through. You don't understand what the senior producer does for putting a current affairs radio show on air with 2 producers. If one of them is out, you don't understand the impact of that. And what do you say? Have 1 senior producer for 4 shows. You don't understand, Mr. Makhathini. Your executive doesn't understand. You don't understand the operations of the SABC. And I haven't even gotten to the public service mandate, Mr. Makhathini. Public service does not have a profit imperative. And therefore, money needs to be generated in other ways. News, and we know news isn't funded, but you need to look at that, because that is key for the SABC. You need to find a way to fund news such that it doesn't really make an impact on everything else. But Mr. Makhathini, there's a lot, and I'm sure you will hear more of it from SABC staffers as this process unfolds. So thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
That was SABC Board Chairperson, Mr. Bongumusa Makhathini, talking to us about some of the developments, and there's so much going on, Leanne. Leaves one's head spinning.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well done.
Okay. That's where we have to leave it. And we obviously have to pass this on to Blaine.